Fáilte. Welcome to this episode of The Language Question, Ceis na Tangan, a conversation about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about their relationship with it and its role in our identity. Our guest in this episode is Professor Louis de Paor. Louis de Paor is one of our major poets as well as a teacher and editor. He is Professor of Irish Studies at Ullscoil na Gaillimhe, as well as publishing 8 collections of poetry. Louis has been editor of a number of major modern collections of Irish poetry. As always, I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation with Louis as much as I enjoyed having it. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your complimentary valuable learning resources and to ensure that you stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Anyhow, here goes with this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Gumwina tú soltas. Louis de Paor is one of our major poets as well as a teacher and editor. He is Professor of Irish Studies in Ullscoil na Gaillimhe, as well as publishing 8 collections of poetry. Louis was editor of Cushgame na Híise Seo with Sean O'Tuma and is editor of Poems of Repossession, Lawer na Hacawala. A Louis a cara tá fáilte is fitherót agus táimid Harabha buíochtaíocht as a bhelín ar an seo. Well, Louis, we are so grateful and it is our great privilege to have you here with us. What I would like to do, Louis, to start with, as we do with all of our guests, is just maybe to go back to the very beginning in terms of your relationship with the language, what Irish was like for you growing up and how that unfolded as life went on.
I suppose Irish was just a given, like everything else was and is if you're a child. Nobody asked you whether you wanted to do sums, multiplication, division, compound interest, and nobody asked you whether you wanted to study the Tishel Ginnadach either. So it was part of the school curriculum from the age of 4, therefore. Irish was a classroom language for me, but it was also perhaps more fundamentally a part of the school curriculum in the mid-1960s than it was perhaps after that. And it's only in retrospect I also realised that I went to a school, Scoilin in Bishopstown, where there was a very considerable degree of commitment to the Irish language at the more senior levels of the school. So I would have been completely unaware of that. But I do remember the very first reader we had in Irish. I remember there were pictures, and there was a picture of one of those old-fashioned cups, blue and white, with the blue and white hoops, and then there was a saucer, and there was the word cup on, and then the word fóchup on, and those were the first words we were taught. And I remember being struck by the familiarity of the objects on the one hand and the strangeness of the language on the other hand. You know, cup was easy to work through as cup on, but fóchup on was kind of strange and exotic. And I was interested from day one, but my recollection is that it didn't really matter whether I was or wasn't interested. There was an emphasis on the language in the classroom. There was a huge amount of time devoted to it by teachers who themselves were committed to the language. From the age of about 9 or 10 or thereabouts, I remember, I can't remember was it Buntu's Kainte, but I do remember kind of aids to audiovisual aids, you know, cutout figures being stuck to black cloths on the blackboard, which was the height of technology at the time. But it suggests the Irish language was progressive and all of the rest of it. There was nothing quite like that for English, for instance, and certainly not for maths. And then I suppose in addition to that, I would have been aware at home from a fairly early age that my father in particular was very pleased always when we showed an interest in the Irish language. So I suppose in a domestic setting, although we didn't speak Irish, my father occasionally would say things in Irish to us. He had certain stock and catchphrases. Whenever he wrote notes to the teachers, he always wrote them in Irish in the old script. So I suppose it was just a given part of the world for me.
And just I'm interested, was your name de Paor?
So that's a very good question. I'm Louis Paor on my baptism cert and my registration of birth, but all names in the classroom were recorded in the Leabhar Rulla in Irish in those days. So in Irish, I was actually Antoine de Player because my second name is Anthony and there was a mistake made the first day and it was never rectified in 8 years in primary school, despite my father saying his name isn't actually Anthony. Uh, but they continued to read out my name. I remember the first guy in the roll was Antoine de Bourca, and I was then next and Antoine de Player. And, that was just a given. So, given the controversy about naming that we have at the moment in Ireland, like I had several different names, and I suppose it never struck me that they were different. It was the same. I had different versions of the same name because it was the same me. And then when I was addressed in my proper name in Irish, I would have been Leishach. But I remember going to university and Donegal Croin, whom I studied with for a while, he actually made fun of the Gaelicization of the French name Louis and said it simply means a man from Laois. And I decided from there on I would be Louis de Puer. That's it. No confusion about my first name, no confusion about my second name. That's it. And it took some time for that to follow through. I was actually in Australia when I finally removed the Paor from my passport and put de Puer in its place. And there was a bit of controversy around that at the time for two reasons. I think one was because it was clear that a lot of Irish people who were illegal in America in particular were throwing away the passports with their English language name and opting for the Irish language one. But there was some discussion also in Australia at the time about, I suppose, dual identities, about Indigenous and Aboriginal people. So one of the questions would always be, what's your tribal name? So I remember thinking when I had to renew a passport, well, it's not a tribal name, it's the exact equivalent. And they were very, very good. The embassy said, look, it's a bit tricky here. We don't have any difficulty with it, but you could find yourself getting stopped coming in and out of different countries because of the change. So initially they said, do you mind if we put Paor in brackets on your passport? And then when that passport ran its course, it was just de Puer completely. So it's kind of interesting, how you come to own your own name and decide your own name. And my feeling on that would have been from the age of 4. I was entitled to decide the name by which people should address me, but they didn't always address me by the name that everybody knew me as. So that's kind of interesting. A bit more heat in it these days.
For sure, it's fascinating, but I love the evolution of that and the ultimate intentionality that you brought to that. And because I think it is such a huge challenge we face. I mean, it's something I'm kind of struggling with in the other direction now, having been Flora McCarthy my entire life, and I'm now looking at just
Yeah.
using Finian McCorrick a bit more frequently, and of course there is almost a slight kind of there's a controversy at the moment about somebody using the Irish version of their name, perhaps just because they didn't want to be identifiable as the same person, and that kind of thing happens. So it's a fascinating subject. But Louis, coming back to your evolution in relation to the language, so there was that encouragement at home, and your dad was very very obviously a speaker and had the Clog Gaeling and so on. But it was a school subject primarily. That's where you experienced it, and then having gone through a very Irish focused primary and secondary school in Spirit Nave, there you then went into, I think, a particularly kind of fertile environment in UCC at the time. Would
Yeah,
that
I
be
suppose the
correct?
first time I would really have used the language in any kind of social context outside the classroom would have been at UCC, and great emphasis was put on that by our instructors at UCC. We were pushed. We shouldn't have had to be pushed, but there was a degree of pressure to speak Irish as much as you could amongst your peers and others. And it didn't seem like a particular burden, in that most of the people I was kind of hanging around with anyway were taking Irish as a subject and were happy to speak Irish amongst ourselves. I think for us at least, it was a fairly unaffected thing. We moved in and out of English and Irish, depending on the circumstances in which we found ourselves, depending on the mix of people in the group who were comfortable speaking Irish or not comfortable speaking Irish. I suppose that's always a challenge for people. Do you always defer to the one person who doesn't understand Irish in a group? And I suppose courtesy and manners say, yes, you do. And I would say, generally speaking, we didn't feel any great pressure to do one thing or another, but we were, I would say, fully bilingual and comfortably bilingual. The big shock really in university was, well, there was two things actually. I'd never been to the Gaeltacht, and it was clear even before I spent my first period of time in the Gaeltacht, which was during my first year in college. And I went a number of times then during that year, and then spent 3 weeks in the following September around Roig, i Gorcalina, and I had the most extraordinary time there. But I took great umbrage at the fact that in the classroom, and particularly in the language laboratories, we were being told that ultimately the native speaker of Irish, the Kerry native speaker of Irish, was the standard. And we somehow had to measure up to that. And I remember thinking, no, that's just not happening at all. Because I remember thinking, is my pronunciation incorrect or correct? My accent is Cork City. I don't want to sound like them. They're clearly country people. They're generally older people. I know about Shannockle and Curry Kainta and the rest of it, but that wouldn't be the way I would speak in English. I'm an urban person, and I remember asking people saying, are you saying that the language isn't mine? Are you saying that in the same way if I was learning French, I should imitate the patterns of Parisian French or whatever? In order to flourish here, I need to speak as if I was over 60 and from West Kerry. And to be fair to our instructors, they were amused, but they took it as a legitimate question and said, yeah, Louis, but you still need to know what correct usage is amongst a community of native speakers, right? You're an individual speaker who speaks in a particular way, but you don't live in a community where it's spoken. So we need to instruct you in a community language, and what you do after that, that's your call. But I do think that when I came to Galway, when I was about 23, 22 maybe, for the first time, there was a much freer approach to those things here than there had been in UCC. There were the fundamentals of language in grammar and pronunciation, and after that, off you go. So I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but I suppose it required a degree of assertion on my part to say, I've been studying this language from the age of 4. I've been only studying French since the age of 12 or 13, but I know the difference between what certain consonant and vowel patterns sound like in the two languages. But ultimately, I'm me, and I'm from Cork.
A very important fact, it has to be said. But the in relation, just before getting into the detail of that, because I am really fascinated by that, but just in terms of your education at primary and secondary, and then at third level, was it Munster Irish the whole way through, or were you being taught in the Kaidan in school, and then
Oh, it would have
Munster
been
in
Munster
UCC?
Irish all the way. I would say there was no teacher in primary school who hadn't trained at Mary Immaculate College, where Munster Irish would have been gospel. I would think certainly the teachers we had in secondary school as well were committed to the Munster dialect, and that continued absolutely in UCC. The only exception I can think of was we had a really brilliant teacher, primary school teacher in 6th class in primary school. Frank Murphy was his name. And if we were very good during the week, he'd read us extracts from Jimeen Varla Haig on a Friday afternoon. And everybody in the class, like there was 55 boys in the class, everybody was hanging on his every word to listen to the Irish language book. But he got us to read at least one extract from an Tilánach in the senior class in primary school. But I do remember him also giving us something from Rohamúr an Tíl by Mickey McGowan. We much preferred Mickey McGowan to an Tilánach, I'd have to say, but we found the Donegal Irish very, very strange. So there was a huge prejudice there, if you want to call it that, or commitment to Munster Irish all the way.
And in terms of UCC, then, I mean, the kind of towering figure there at that period, I think, is Sean O'Toole, and would he have been the major influence there
Yeah,
on the
absolutely.
unit?
I'd actually mentioned two people. Sean was a huge figure, and I suppose he was a person who had a profile outside the university as well, as a language activist committed to structural, institutional policy change at governmental level. You know, he would have had a very public profile there, and people would have known who he was. So that certainly impressed itself upon us. And then we discovered later that he'd been a very popular and quite controversial playwright, although he didn't say a lot about that in the early period of our getting to know him. But he used to organise creative writing workshops in the West Kerry Gaeltacht every year at Christmas in the years that I was there, and that was hugely enabling and liberating. But I would also say I did Lean Dúchais in UCC with Geroid O'Crowley and Diarmid O'Gilláin. I did that in second and third year, so all of the material was taught through Irish. So I did folklore through Irish, I did medieval Irish and early modern Irish history through Irish. I did a module with Micheál O'Sullivan in the Department of Music, and I would say that Geroid O'Crowley in Lean Dúchais was a huge influence on my thinking more generally, but also on my relationship to the Irish language.
On that, then, in relation to, because you did your PhD, I think, in on Martin O'Kine, with Sean
Yeah.
O'Toole, am I correct? So, but so here we're talking about, again, a giant of Connacht Irish, and how did you find that
I
transition?
did what I was told. Not a characteristic of much of my life, but I was invited to consider doing postgraduate studies in both Lean Dúchais and Irish, and I still have a hankering after the road not taken, because Gearóid O'Crowley was thinking at the time about what turned out to be the Northside Folklore Project. And his idea was that there had been perhaps an overemphasis on the collection of rural Irish language material by the Irish Folklore Commission, and that there was legitimate folk material in an urban working class setting as well. And what he proposed to me was that I would begin work as a kind of an ethnographer of the north side, or a community in the north side of Cork City. And I was totally taken with that. I thought that was an amazing project. Sean Tuama suggested several projects I might be interested in, one of which was that I might look at Davio Brother's work. There had been a huge amount done at that stage. It was about 1981 on O'Brother, and he also suggested O'Kine. And I came back to him and I said, I'm not really interested in O'Kine. I'm thinking I'd really like to do O'Brother, but if I had my choice, I'd probably end up on the north side. And he persuasively argued that that might not be a great career move. And then I said, well, I'll do O'Brother. So, and he said, no, you'll do O'Kine. So that was it. So that was an eye opener, because it took, you know, O'Kine is difficult enough anyway in terms of the literary linguistic aspect of his work, but having absolutely no direct acquaintance with Connemara Irish, that made it a little bit more difficult. So at a fairly early stage, I took the opportunity to come to Galway and spend some time here, and it was really, really strange. You know, it was like going from Cork to Melbourne in the English language. You know, you knew it was the same language, but everything about it, including the word order, was different. And there wasn't a lot of work being done on O'Kine at the time. You know, really is only in the last 10. I said to somebody, you know, I did a PhD thesis on him, and I couldn't even pick a row with my supervisor about him, that there was so little engagement with his work. And it's been just fantastic in the last 5 to 10 years, I'd say. Yeah, about 5 to 10 years, that the academic world is now bristling with new ideas about Martin O'Kine, and there's a real debate going on there. So that's been great, but it wasn't like that at the time.
And you mentioned there that whole issue about the, let's say, received, standard Munster was West Kerry, you know, 60-year-old fisherman, farmer, native inhabitant of Corcaguina. But then, kind of around the time you were there, there emerged, or had emerged, I think, around that time or previous to that, a kind of a city-based, because I'm thinking particularly of Michael Davitt and the Inti poets and so on. I mean, how what did that represent for you in terms of your
I should
interaction with the
say, I
language?
mean, absolutely no disrespect at all to the 60-year-old fisherman or Banatee. Like, the people I stayed with were the most extraordinarily sophisticated, cultured, linguistically and verbally agile people. Like, I hadn't come across anybody quite like them. Their self consciousness about language, the excellence of their speech patterns. If they were speaking in English, their ability was the kind of ability we associate usually with poetry or with the upper registers of language. So that wasn't it. It was just the idea that somehow the
It
life
wasn't
patterns
you.
and the life experience was
Yeah.
different to mine. I understood that they were masters of language and that I could learn on that side from them. But and I'm not saying that my resistance was correct either. All I'm saying is that that's how I felt at the time. But I stayed with Nelny Kineda. Her brother Tommaso Kineda hadn't published then a book that came out later called Er Shachron, and in the evenings he'd have dictionaries that he'd bring out and he'd challenge you on a particular word. His grasp of the language was the kind of it was an element of there was an element of fun and play, but complete mastery of language there. And it's often been said by Nuala Golan and others that Daniel Kane's pub Tí Chahaid, where we used to go and drink, he had 3 dictionaries behind the counter. And if he was a little bit idle, Daniel Kane would start an argument about what the proper meaning of a word was. So all of that was an instruction. You could say it was a kind of Ulscoil Scarte, the time we spent in the West Kerry Gaeltacht. So that was a hugely formative and fundamental part of my induction into the Irish language. The Inti poets were in UCC 10 years before me, which seems like not a long time now, but when you're 18 or 17, that's a lifetime ago. I would have to say that they were completely invisible to us when we started off at UCC. They weren't mentioned inside or outside the classroom. And the first indication we had was when Michael Davitt, that such a thing existed at all, was when Michael Davitt put an ad in the Cork Examiner to say that he was collecting material for the 4th issue of Inte. And I remember being in the West Kerry Gaeltacht with Colin Branach, and I cut the thing out of the paper to show it to Colin. And I said, like, do you know anything about these fellas? And so we sent off poems to Eaton, and they were accepted for publication by Davitt. And that was a revelation. And then the second year, I think first year we went to West Kerry with Sean O'Tuama. The guest poet was Michael Hartnett. So shortly after he had completed his farewell to English and his first book in Irish, Irica Brick had come out. So it was a big deal. And O'Tuama felt this was a significant moment, and it was good for us. At the age of 17, when you think about it, we were being introduced to the work of a poet already celebrating the English language. And then I think the following year was the year that he brought Michael Davitt. So Inti Carr hadn't come out yet. So then we met Davitt and played pool with him and looked at his poems. He hadn't published a collection yet, and things just took off from there then, because you realise, I suppose we'd already worked out that the closest model to what we might be looking for in terms of spoken Irish was Sean O'Tuama himself. As he said about himself, a native Irish speaker from Blackpool, Cork. So the way he spoke was urban, And then to have David in the next generation doing the same, absorbing the dialect of Corcovina, but manipulating it in interesting ways. So he's clearly completely at home in the tradition and the community language and the standard of Corcovina, but he's also at home in the world of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan and Patrick Street on a Saturday afternoon. And that's what we were all looking to do as well, I think. So the relationship to David and to Inta generally then became really, really strong in the next 5 to 10 years, I would say.
You mention a word there, invisibility, and that's a word that I'd like to come back to because I see a theme there. And this is just extraordinary to me because just looking at the dates, I had assumed that you would have all been just cross pollinating, continuously, and so that's extraordinary that there was even invisibility, let's say, within that tiny community of the Irish language in a place like
Well, I
Cork and
suppose to be
UCC.
fair, now they were gone. They were in Dublin.
Yeah.
Shortly after they all graduated, they disappeared. Nuala went to Holland and then to Turkey. Liam ended up working in RTE. Michael was working with Gaeling, and they were involved in Irish language circles and theatre circles and media circles in Dublin, but not really in Cork. The connection was certainly not there at that early stage.
So from my recollection of your chronology now, I think let's say if we get to the end of your PhD, we're in about the mid '80s, I think, and I was wondering if you would be. There's a poem of yours, Corcoch, and I assume, first of all, I assume it's a biographical poem. I'm not sure if that's a correct assumption, and I assume it's around this period of. I mean, you left to go to Australia in 1987.
Yeah,
Is that correct? Would this have been around that? Would it have been that kind of? Was this the story of that poem? Would you mind
sure.
telling
I
us?
suppose I'm always hesitant about the idea that poetry is a form of autobiography. I'd always like to insist that poetry is fiction, like short stories and novels are. But then the more you look into it, the more the the tipping point between autobiography and what we understand as fiction is more difficult to establish than those two terms would suggest. So John McGarren is a fiction writer, but his fiction is an account of his life. I'd like to have the same, I suppose, idea here that you're drawing on aspects of your own engagement with the world, but that you're moving it in another direction. I like the idea that Seamus Heaney has somewhere that if a poem is to work at all and it derives from personal experience, it must engage the personal experience at a depth and a level that goes beyond the personal. And I suppose I always have that idea this is not a diary. It may function as a diary sometimes, but unless what I'm articulating corresponds to what other people have felt or experienced or imagined, then it's clearly not going to work as a poem. So aspects of that poem, Corcach, certainly correspond to my own experience, but I wouldn't think that every detail of the poem is factually accurate as a record of my life or my response to a particular moment. If I remember, if I remember correctly, the poem came about the last time I was home from Australia before we came home for good, and I had a sense that time, and I remember explaining it to my parents that I was at the stage where I didn't think it was likely that I would get back again to visit, so that it may well be that they wouldn't see me again. And I can't remember how many children we had at that stage, but we had already made up our minds that this is too expensive, it's too difficult, it's too disconcerting, so we can't be making Ireland our holiday from now on. At that stage, we used to come back every second year if we could at all. So I suppose even though it's not the first departure, it felt a bit like that, and it felt more like you were going away for good this time. And yeah, I suppose that's what the that's where the poem occurs. And I was playing also with the word Corcach, Corcaig meaning a bog, and something that's a bit, sloppy and messy and murky. And that felt like a kind of a metaphor even for what was going on, I suppose, between me and particularly my father that day. He was distressed, and uh, really, I suppose it's the relationship between the father and son at that moment of separation. So, like it in a way, it corresponds more to the experience of a previous generation to mine, that going to Australia or America was a death in the family. In my time, that wasn't really the case, but it felt like that this time. And I suppose the poem ends in a way. I'm always a little uneasy about that poem, and I was very uneasy when I finished it initially, because I had finished it elsewhere than where it finishes now. And I went back a few times, and a few people who were very good judges of my work went back and said, I don't think you've worked through the thing here at all. So what happens in the very last section of the poem was a big shock to me when it happened. I didn't think that's what I was going to say or what I was trying to say. And then I realized that's what the poem is saying. And I suppose that's instructive also about the way that poetry works. I remember hearing Pat McCabe talking about the butcher boy. He said, I still remember, he said, the shock the day I realised he was going to kill Mrs. Nugent. So I suppose when you're writing poems, you also realise that something here is working according to a logic that's other than the logic that applies otherwise. And I did not see the end of the poem coming the way it eventually got written. Yeah. Did you want me to read it?
I'd love to if you would.
Okay, so le me as gailing ar dúise agus an son as béle. Corcach. Bhí sé fuairfluch ar French's Key is mé a tríal a rí Seán Maile. An chart in a seasamh chó dlú leis a gosán le bord suhig búilte le chala. Seanamhhaoin stracathe ón monarchan dúnta is scríbe fallan na cé san áit in ar tháinig na Froncaig I dír. I gcathair na gúin is an áing a titim an spéir, hí fáinne tarthála scortha dá chuaile trasna na sráide ó theach na sochride. Bhí sclog fibi an bhardais á dachta ag femin bhrúscar a bhrúch de níos sa trofhaí hir, is madarí baite á dúirt chun siúl I málaí gúil ar farrig amach I dro an fasáiste hir. Bhí cúil na carte cho clothair le cisten, cho díanach ar isce le bondún éisc, nó gur hit deor mhúr a bhain ar ghruan a fuinóige, hill tre scuilt sa ghline is ghurt ar ghreid sráine ma chaptín a hig gan chor sa síochan tosig. Nuair a bhris na buink taobh hir do chuaile mathair, ní chréachach galún stein an ráig a bhris tre fáil sa firmament ar micheann baite. Bhí stúicanna aglaise is bóithre íring á lúba, críthe is brointe muilling á smite, fallaí is leacacha sráide tuair dútha, an talamh a boga is gur an áil an fortig in uachtar a ríis an an hain. Badalium go dréiging an chré ró bhog dar dithme, sar a bhaisc fi an deor dhearnach as an gloch im lár, sar a gahach an grá a gá láimh timpeall mo bhainil, dom haring síos go tóin an fuil a bhaile. It was cold and wet on French's Quay the day I left, the car tight to the curb as the side of a ship tied up at the pier. Worn-out tires from the shut-down factory scraped the quay wall where the rats had come ashore. In our submarine town, the river rained down from above. A lifebelt worked its way free from a mooring post across the street from Ford's funeral home. Corporation gutters were choked with wrack brought in by the tide as drowned dogs stowed away in coal bags were washed out to sea through Passage West. The back of the car was warm as a kitchen, watertight as a fish's arse. until a single swollen drop fell on the windscreen, trickled through a crack in the reinforced glass and along the bridge of our captain's nose, where he sat unmoved in the front seat. When the riverbanks broke behind my father's eyes, tin buckets couldn't bail me out as tears gushed through the eye of a needle and Jesus wept over my submerged head. Church spires and railway lines crumpled, millstones and hearts like stone were broken, walls and flagstones buckled as the earth moved and the asthmatic bog filled my lungs again. I couldn't wait to get away from the soft, soft earth that had made me, before the last tear was squeezed from the stone in my heart, before love wrapped itself round my neck, dragging me, drowning, home.
Thank you, Louis. I mean, you practically need a towel after listening to that poem. It's. You capture the wateriness of Cork. I mean, twinned with Atlantis, I think at times. In an exceptional way.
A colleague of mine here, the great historian Gerard O'Tuig, when I read it publicly, I think probably for the first time, said it was a very good example of a little known subgenre of poetry called Cork apocalyptic, with Paddy Galvin's The Mad Woman of Cork as the principal contender in the field. So I was pretty pleased with that.
Wonderful. So, Louis, that I think transitions us nicely then to. I mean, that it was. I think at that point around the time of your move to Australia. But could you tell us about moving to Australia then, and particularly just what impact that had on your relationship with the language?
So it was very interesting, I suppose, on a couple of fronts. I mean, I could talk forever about it or talk for longer than we have here, but I would say a few things. For me, first of all, it was an extraordinarily liberating experience. I was at home looking after our children, and for the first time, my 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 work was divided into two sections. First of all, I was what they called in Australia the primary caregiver, which meant being a father and a stay-at-home father was my principal occupation and activity. And beyond that, writing became the central element, a very secondary element, but still an element in it. And I discovered very early on that this was a very liberating time in Australia generally because multiculturalism was the government policy. And in terms of the arts, there was a real commitment to diversifying the languages of Australia in literature. So I found that I was eligible to apply for writers' grants for writing in Irish. Not only that, but it was not required of me that I provide English translations. An element of multicultural policy meant that it was up to them to discover whether the material in Chinese or Irish or Estonian was worthy of funding. So I was quite generously funded over 3 or 4 years by the Australia Council. From very early on, I was being invited to do readings. So at one stage, I was doing at least one reading a week, and as often as not, I was doing more than that. I won a couple of awards for Irish language poetry here in Ireland, which were reported in the mainstream national media in Australia. I was being brought on to whatever would be the flagship morning radio program for RTE, the equivalent of that in Australia. So while it might seem that it would be an inhibiting factor in terms of poetry and language, I can't imagine I would have moved as quickly to the point where writing poetry was a fundamental, necessary element in the routine of my day, week, year. In Ireland, it wouldn't have happened as quickly as it did in Australia. The other side of that was, so the second aspect of it then was very quickly found other Irish language speakers. I was involved in teaching Irish and involved in setting up the Common Gaeilge in Australia. I became very friendly with a guy called Maurice O'Scaunline, Mossy Scanlon, who's published an autobiography in Irish and recorded his own singing in Irish. He was working with the Melbourne Gas Company at the time, and he used to arrive at the door of my house in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. So it became a normal enough thing for the kids to hear me speaking Irish to somebody. I should also say one of the reasons I was so keen to role swap with my wife was I wanted to speak Irish to the kids. So I spoke Irish to the kids until they resisted it to the point where I realized this may eventually lead to them being negatively disposed towards Irish. But I'd say for about 5 years, I would have spoken predominantly Irish to them. So all that was very, very positive, and I was publishing and writing academic work and poetry. But I then realized I was 9 years there in all, and in the last 3 or 4 years of my time there, I realized that I was beginning to lose a sense of the edges of words. They were beginning to blur a little bit for me, that my vocabulary was contracting, that I had no authority other than myself and Mossy, perhaps, who's a native speaker of Irish from West Kerry, but that the kind of creativity in your use of language that comes from speaking the language every day to people or working in Irish language environment, I didn't have that. So I used to say to people I could understand how Robinson Crusoe, if he stayed long enough on the island, would forget how to speak English, because I felt that I could eventually forget what all these words mean. Not all of them, but my range was definitely narrowing, and my understanding of the nice blurry bits and the edgy bits that poetry works with, I was less confident of that. So amongst the many reasons for coming home, the language was certainly one of them.
And because there's so much there, and there's so much I'd love to dive in. But as you say, we have a limited amount of time, so then there's a lot of stuff I want to get to. But it's in terms of so that it accelerated and in a way liberated you, I think, in your use of the language. But then you decided coming back was the next obvious step. What did that look like, and how did that work for you?
Well, we always intended to come home, but then everybody does, and the longer you're away, the more difficult it is to come back. And then my wife had a work injury, which meant she couldn't continue to work, so we had to come home. And she and the kids settled very quickly. It took me a lot longer to settle back here. I found Australia a far more hospitable place in the latter years. Oh, well, throughout the time we were there, I suppose, in many ways, than Ireland was. And perhaps I'd forgotten some of the skills required to survive in Ireland. But it was a good time to come back. You know, TG Carr was established the year we came back. There was a kind of what turned out to be quite a temporary surge in terms of Irish language literature being more visible and audible and all the rest of it. But it certainly tided us over. Like, it was 4 years before I got secure work. But for the 4 years between 1996 and 2000, I was able to support a family with 5 children based on piecework, if you like, and doing bits and pieces of things. And mostly to do with writing in Irish or teaching the Irish language. So that was an enabling thing.
And I want to come to the work now, and if you don't mind, but I just would like to just finish this kind of evolution of your life with the language, just because you mentioned something briefly there in passing in relation to you spoke Irish to the kids when they were small, and then it got to a point where that was no longer productive, or you felt that it might be counterproductive. What does Irish look like in your life now outside of writing and education? Do you
Well, I
use it
suppose
in
I
the family?
have to say that I'm working in a bilingual workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So my working environment is bilingual, and therefore the interactions I have with people here are predominantly English, but a significant part of that is in Irish as well. Um, in the domestic setting, 2 of our children would be completely fluent in Irish. One of them went to all Gaeltacht schools until she left home. Basically, I'd speak Irish to her and she'd speak English back to me. That's a fairly common pattern. But I'd say, the 5 of the children, 4 of them would be good speakers of Irish with a strong interest. 2 of them are teachers and find Irish their favourite thing to teach in the classroom. But it's still the case that even in Galway, where there are more opportunities, I suppose, socially to speak in Irish, it's still limited. But I would say that in Galway, there are any number of opportunities. If I was to walk from one end of Galway to the other on a Saturday afternoon, it would be unusual if I got to the end without having met somebody or passed somebody capable of and wanting to speak in Irish rather than English. So there's potential there, I think. How you harness that is another matter.
What's your internal dialogue?
Yeah, people ask that all the time, and it's a kind of a trick question. I know that over the years, my wife has often complained to me that when I talk in my sleep, I speak in Irish. That seems like it suggests that Irish is my internal language. I'm not so sure. I feel like I'm fully bilingual. That's it. There is nothing I want to say or write or do that I can't do equally well and equally badly in Irish and in English.
One of the things that I've noticed or just observed in listening to what you've said and reading, particularly your introduction to Laura na Hakavala, just is about the whole question. And we mentioned earlier, just the whole question of invisibility of Irish language literature in the Irish language or in the English, the Anglo-Irish universe. What is first of all, your view in relation to translation of your work? You very kindly read us a translation of your work there when reading your poem earlier. But what is your view, first of all, in relation to translation and in relation to that whole vexed relationship of Irish with English in Ireland in particular?
So it continues to be problematic in that it's still presumed that the basis for translation is excellence, that if it's good enough, it'll be translated into English. That's completely untrue. It's also the case that unless you're available bilingually, you are immediately excluded from various platforms. I think there is a kind of a literary apartheid at work in Ireland. That's the term that was used by Lara Cassidy of the Arts Council back in the 1980s, at a time when he was determined to make sure that stopped in terms of Arts Council funding and the rest of it. But, when was the last time you saw an Irish language author reviewed in the weekend newspapers, the Irish Times, the Independent, the Examiner? Are we to presume that not a single book by an Irish language author is as good as the books that are reviewed in those outlets every week? In terms of art shows on radio and television, I would say that the art show on RT Radio 1 is probably quite good in its openness to other languages, but generally speaking, Irish is inaudible and more or less invisible, I would say, in the mainstream platforms. And I think one of the things that's happened here is that maybe it's because we've now come to the point where there's TG Cahir, there's Radio na Gaeltacht, their Irish language magazines and journals, and the idea is, well, they have their own forums and platforms, but that's a kind of ghettoization, and it's accepting somehow that there are two Irelands split by language, which I don't think any Irish speaker or Irish language writer would agree is the case. We are all fully bilingual. If you look at significant moments in our recent literary history, the death of Seamus Heaney, the death of Evan Boland, if you look at all the tribute programs on radio and television, is it really the case that Biddy Jenkinson and Nuala Ní Dhónall have nothing to say about Seamus or Evan because they write in a different language? Is it to be understood that when Máire Vakatí died, nobody who wasn't an Irish language writer could say anything about her? That seems to me to be entirely reductive from both an Irish language and an English language perspective. But I don't honestly know how you rectify that. You can have quotas like we have for gender equality, but those are kind of stopgap measures. But if you go back to the 1980s and you look at the central position in RTE, in the Irish Times, in other outlets, the central and powerful roles that people who were bilingual Irish and English speakers had in those organizations, there was a far greater sense that we have literature and culture in two languages, and that must be reflected in these mainstream outlets. You know, you think of the programs that Sean O'Morga did, you think of the work that Dirny Vrian did, you think of the work that Michael Davitt did when he was working for RTE, you think of Cathal Gohan and the work that he did, Cathal Porter, right? There were people in those positions of influence and power. I thought the other thing that's clear to me here is because I live in the west of Ireland, this isn't just a feature of the Irish language and the English language and the unequal relationship between them. It's also a function of the relationship between Dublin and everywhere else, right? So at the heart of the Dublin networks of the 1980s, there were Irish speakers and native Irish speakers and Irish language writers and academics and others. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore, and Dublin still dominates our culture and the literary world in which we operate.
Yeah, I thought it was just incredibly interesting recently in connection with International Women's Day. The Irish Times had a feature at the weekend in relation to women writing poetry and in prose literature, and in relation to Irish language poets, Máire Wachity was the only one that apart from Eilish. Eileen Dooney Connell from the 18th century, and I just thought it was incredible that first of all, no living female poet writing in the Irish language was mentioned, and the only prose writer was Peg.
Again, going back, I mean, you don't want to be talking about the good old days and the rest of it, but while John Banville was literary editor of the Irish Times, Irish language books, novels, collections of poetry were being reviewed, despite the fact that he himself, as to the best of my knowledge, is not competent in Irish. So this is a relatively new thing, the Anglophone, Anglo-centric view of our literature is kind of extraordinary. I mean, it's marvellous to see Colleen Cewin butting in, barging in, elbowing in gently to the middle of all of that. But it's as if it's the exceptionalism of that. It makes it almost exotic. And you're kind of going, there's nothing exotic about it, right? The exotic thing here is Martin McDonagh, for better and for worse.
Louis, just what is your one question that I put here at the end, and I'd like to just ask you to wrap it up for us, if you like, would be, what is your Irish language why? Why have you devoted so much of your life to the language, teaching of the language, writing of the language? What's your motivation?
Again, I suppose my immediate reaction always to that question would be, why not? When the question is asked, it straight away suggests it's abnormal, like, why do you run marathons? Why are you vegan? Why are you this, that, or the other thing? It always presumes that the person being questioned is eccentric somehow. That it just seems to me, I'm astounded that everybody doesn't think the same way as I do. I'm particularly surprised that people who had the same formation as I did would have a different view. For me, it's an enhancement of my life that I wouldn't willingly do without any more than I would do without poetry. And I wish I spoke Italian and German and Arabic and Spanish as well. I know I would be the richer for it. And therefore, of course, for me, my experience is richer by being bilingual. That's not to say that anybody who chooses to be monolingual is anyway lesser. But for me, I would certainly be less fully myself if I didn't have Irish. And I'd like to think I will extend myself into Italian, certainly at some stage in the future. I did Latin at school, and even to this day, there's something in me that reacts very well to the grammar of Latin.
Wonderful. Louis a cara grov míle bahagut fwyn me an tanavas an scéal a rain túlin berbua agus banach de cara.
Walter Roth.
Thanks for listening. Gur raibh míle maith agat as a bheith éisteacht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tamil.